In the misty village of St. Mary's Hollow, Miss Jane Marple arrives at eerie Harrow Hall, where whispers of a long-lost bride, Lady Beatrice, haunt the shadows, as ghostly visions and chilling secrets unravel hidden diaries, buried lockets, and a dark truth in an old well. Miss Marple's keen eye uncovers a decades-old tragedy of love and betrayal. Will she bring peace to the restless widow and the fractured household? Dive into a gripping mystery where every creak holds a clue. Chapter 1. The House on Marigold Lane. In the quiet village of St. Mary's Hollow, where the morning mist clung to the hedgerows, and the church bell tolled with a mournful cadence, Miss Jane Marple sat on the porch of her neat, ivy-clad cottage. The villagers called it the widow's porch, though Miss Marple was no widow, and the name had always struck her as a quaint affectation. Her knitting needles clicked rhythmically, a soft counterpoint to the distant cawing of rooks. The cottage, tucked at the end of Marigold Lane, was a modest affair, its whitewashed walls and rose trellises blending seamlessly with the pastoral charm of the village. Yet, for all its simplicity, it was a vantage point. From her wicker chair, Miss Marple could observe the comings and goings of St. Mary's Hollow, the postman's uneven stride, the vicar's hurried consultations, the furtive glances of neighbours behind lace curtains. It was a Tuesday in late October, and the air carried the crisp bite of autumn, redolent with the scent of damp leaves and wood smoke. Miss Marple, her silver spectacles perched on her nose, was halfway through a skein of grey wool when the postman, young Tom Bailey, appeared at the gate. His cheeks were flushed, not from the chill but from some private agitation, and he clutched a single letter as if it were a summons from the Crown. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp as ever despite her advancing years, noted the black edging on the envelope. A death, perhaps, or a formality masking something more sinister. She set her knitting aside and rose, her movements deliberate but sprightly, betraying none of the stiffness one might expect from a woman of her age. "Good morning, Tom," she said, her voice gentle but with a clarity that invited no nonsense. "You look as though you've seen a ghost." Tom managed a weak smile, handing her the letter. "Morning, Miss Marple. It's from Harrow Hall, ma'am. Mrs. Harrow herself wrote it, I reckon." Looked urgent-like. Miss Marple took the envelope, her fingers brushing the coarse paper. The handwriting was elegant but hurried, the ink smudged in places as if penned in haste. "Thank you, Tom," she said, her tone dismissing him as politely as it encouraged him to linger no longer than necessary. He tipped his cap and hurried off, casting a glance back as if the letter carried a weight he was glad to be rid of. Returning to her chair, Miss Marple opened the letter with a small silver paper knife, a relic from her father's desk. The contents were brief but unsettling. "Dear Jane, I trust this finds you well. It has been too long since we last spoke, and I regret that my words must now carry such unease. Something is amiss at Harrow Hall. I cannot put a name to it perhaps. It is merely an old woman's fancy, but the house feels heavy with secrets. Whispers in the night, footsteps where no one should be. I fear for Clara, my daughter, who grows paler each day. Would you come to us, Jane? Your clarity of mind is a comfort I sorely need. I enclose directions to the hall. Forgive the imposition, but I am at a loss. Yours in friendship, Evelyn Horomis." Marple folded the letter, her lips pursed in thought. Evelyn Harrow was no hysteric. She was a woman of sense, widowed young and left to manage a sprawling estate with only her daughter and a handful of servants. The mention of whispers and footsteps stirred something in Miss Marple's memory tales of Harrow Hall, whispered in the village tea room of a bride who vanished decades ago, leaving only rumors of tragedy. She glanced at the garden, where marigolds drooped under the weight of dew, and made up her mind. By noon, she had packed a valise with essentials, few frocks, her knitting, a notebook, and a well-worn copy of The Vicar of Wakefield, and set off for Harrow Hall. The walk to the estate was a mile or so, along a winding lane flanked by hawthorn, hedges, and the occasional oak, its branches gnarled like the fingers of an ancient giant. St. Mary's Hollow was a place of quiet beauty, but it was not without its shadows. The villagers, though kind, were quick to weave tales of misfortune, and Harrow Hall was a favourite subject. Built in the reign of Queen Anne, it had once been the pride of the county, its gardens rivaling those of Blenheim. But time and neglect had taken their toll, and now it stood as a monument to faded glory. Its stone facade weathered, its windows dark. As Miss Marple approached, the hall emerged from the mist, its turrets piercing the sky like sentinels. The iron gates were ajar, creaking faintly in the breeze. She stepped through, her sensible shoes crunching on the gravel drive, and took in the scene. The lawns were overgrown, the flower beds choked with weeds, and the air carried a faint mustiness, as if the house itself were exhaling secrets. A figure appeared at the door, Mrs. Evelyn Harrow, her face pale but composed, her dark dress stark against the grey stone. "Jane, you came," Evelyn said, her voice a mix of relief and strain. She clasped Miss Marple's hands, her own cold despite the heavy shawl draped over her shoulders. "I cannot thank you enough." "It's no trouble at all, Evelyn," Miss Marple replied, her tone soothing but alert. "Your letter was most intriguing. Now, tell me everything." Evelyn led her into the hall, through a cavernous foyer where a chandelier hung like a frozen cascade, its crystals dulled by dust. The drawing room was no less grand but equally neglected, its velvet curtains faded and its furniture shrouded in an air of disuse. A fire crackled in the grate, but it did little to dispel the chill. Evelyn gestured to a chair, and Miss Marple sat, her valise at her feet, her eyes scanning the room. A portrait above the mantel caught her attention, a stern-faced man in a powdered wig, his gaze cold and unyielding. Lord Harrow, she presumed, Evelyn's late husband. "Clara is upstairs," Evelyn began, her hands twisting a lace handkerchief. "She's not been herself. She hears things, voices, footsteps, sometimes a cry. At first, I thought it was her imagination, but I've heard them too. Last night, I woke to a sound like weeping, coming from the west wing, where no one sleeps." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene but her mind already turning. "And who else is in the house?" "There's Clara, of course. Then Major Reginald Blackwood, a friend of my late husband's, staying with us for a few weeks. Dr. Simon Vale, our physician, who visits often and sometimes stays overnight. And Mrs. Lydia Crane, the housekeeper, who's been with the family since before I married. The maids and cook come daily but live in the village." "A small household for such a large house," Miss Marple remarked, her tone light but probing. "Yes," Evelyn said, her eyes flickering to the window. "It's too large for us now, but Clara loves it, and I cannot bear to leave." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Clara Harrow, a girl of 20, with delicate features and eyes that seemed too large for her pale face. She wore a simple dress of dove grey, her auburn hair pinned loosely, as if she had dressed in haste. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice soft but trembling. "Mother said you were coming. I'm so glad." Miss Marple smiled. noting the girl's nervous hands and the faint shadows under her eyes. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Clara. Your mother tells me you've been troubled by strange noises." Clara glanced at Evelyn, then nodded. "It's the widow," she whispered. "The widow in white. I've seen her gliding through the corridors, her gown trailing like mist. Last night, she stood at the foot of my bed, just watching." Evelyn's face tightened, but Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice gentle. "Tell me about this widow, Clara. What do you know of her?" Clara hesitated, then spoke in a rush. "Her name was Lady Beatrice Harrow. She married my great-uncle, Lord Edmund Harrow, 50 years ago. On their wedding night, she disappeared. Some say she ran away with a lover, others that she was murdered. The villagers say her ghost haunts the hall, looking for justice." "Nonsense," came a gruff voice from the doorway. Major Blackwood strode in, his military bearing evident in his squared shoulders and clipped stride. He was a man of 50, with a ruddy complexion and a mustache that bristled like a hedgehog. Ghosts and ghouls. The girls had been reading too many novels. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. "Perhaps, Major, but strange noises are worth investigating, don't you think?" He snorted, but his gaze shifted uneasily. "Old houses creak. Nothing more." The conversation paused as Mrs. Crane entered, bearing a tea tray. She was a thin woman, her face lined with years of service, her eyes darting as if expecting rebuke. She set the tray down with a clatter, muttered an apology, and retreated. Miss Marple noted the housekeeper's trembling hands and the way her apron was knotted too tightly, as if to anchor her nerves. Tea was served, and Miss Marple steered the conversation to lighter matters, the village fete, the harvest season while observing her companions. Clara sipped her tea sparingly, her eyes fixed on the window. Evelyn's smile was strained, her fingers shredding the edge of her handkerchief. Major Blackwood dominated the conversation, recounting tales of his campaigns in India, but his laughter rang hollow. When Dr. Vale arrived, a lean man with a scholarly air and a habit of adjusting his spectacles, the room seemed to tighten, as if his presence altered its chemistry. "Miss Marple," Dr. Vale said, bowing slightly, "a pleasure. I trust you're here to put these foolish ghost stories to rest." "I'm here to help a friend," she replied, her tone mild but her eyes sharp, "and perhaps to listen to the house. It has much to say, I think." Dinner was a formal affair, served in a dining room lit by flickering candles. The table was set with silver that gleamed despite the hall's decay, and the food roast pheasant, creamed potatoes, and a tart apple pudding was surprisingly fine. Miss Marple sat opposite Clara, noting the girl's reluctance to eat and the way her eyes darted to the shadowed corners. Major Blackwood ate heartily, his conversation loud and punctuated by abrupt laughs. Dr. Vale was quieter, his comments precise but guarded. Evelyn presided with a fragile grace, her attempts at hospitality undercut by the tension in her voice. After dinner, Miss Marple excused herself to explore the house, claiming a need to stretch her legs. The corridors were a labyrinth of oak, paneling and faded tapestries, the air heavy with the scent of beeswax and mildew. She paused at a window overlooking the garden, where moonlight silvered the overgrown rose bushes. A movement caught her larger figure, too solid for a ghost, slipping into the shadows near the old well. She made a mental note to investigate. Further, in her room, a high-ceilinged chamber with a four-poster bed and a view of the moors. Miss Marple unpacked her valise. She placed her knitting on the bedside table, beside a small oil lamp, and opened her notebook. With a pencil, she jotted down her observations. Clara's fear, Evelyn's unease, Blackwood's bluster, Vale's reserve, Crane's nerves. The house, too, was a character, its creaks and sighs, its hidden corners, its whispers. She underlined the word whispers twice as she prepared for bed. Slipping into a flannel nightgown and brushing out her hair, the house seemed to settle. Around her, the wind rattled the windows, and somewhere in the distance, a floorboard creaked. Miss Marple paused, her brush still in hand, and listened. The sound came again, deliberate, like footsteps pacing a room above. She smiled faintly. "Well, well," she murmured. "It seems Harrow Hall is eager to tell its story." She climbed into bed, pulling the quilts close, but sleep did not come easily. Her mind turned over the letter, the whispers, the widow. In white, she thought of her own village, where every face held a story, every gesture a clue. People, she knew, were much the same, everywhere driven by love, fear, greed, or guilt. And houses, like people, kept their secrets close, revealing them only to those who knew how to listen. The clock struck midnight, and the whispers began. They were faint at first, a murmur like wind through leaves, but they grew clearer, forming fragments of words. Help. Find me. Miss Marple lay still, her eyes open in the dark, her heart steady. She had heard such whispers before, not from ghosts, but from the living, their secrets echoing through time. Tomorrow she would begin to unravel them. The night stretched on, and Miss Marple, her mind as sharp as her knitting needles, planned her next steps. She would speak to Clara alone, explore the West Wing, and keep an eye on Major Blackwood's temper. Dr. Vale's late-night walks warranted attention, and Mrs. Crane's reticence suggested a knowledge she was reluctant to share. The house on Marigold Lane, with its quiet porch and watchful roses, seemed far away now, but Miss Marple carried its calm with her. She was, after all, no stranger to mysteries, and Harrow Hall, for all its grandeur and gloom, was simply another puzzle waiting to be solved. As the whispers faded and the house fell silent, Miss Marple closed her eyes, her thoughts as orderly as her knitting. The truth, she knew, was like a dropped stitchy sea to overlook, but impossible to ignore once you knew where to look. Chapter 2. The shadow of Harrow Hall. The morning sun struggled through the heavy clouds over Harrow Hall, casting a pallid light across its weathered stone facade. Miss Jane Marple stood at her bedroom window, her hands folded neatly in front of her, her eyes tracing the outlines of the estate's neglected gardens. The rose bushes, tangled and thorned, seemed to guard secrets as stubbornly as the house itself. She had slept lightly, her dreams threaded with the whispers she'd heard. At midnight soft, pleading, and unmistakably human. Now, as the household stirred below, she dressed in a tweed skirt and a lavender cardigan, her movements precise, her mind already sifting through the impressions of the previous evening. Breakfast was served in the dining room, where the long, mahogany table gleamed under a layer of polish that could not disguise its age. The air was thick with the scent of kedgeree and toast, but the atmosphere was heavier still, weighted by unspoken tensions. Evelyn Harrow presided at the head of the table, her face drawn, her fingers toying with a silver spoon. Clara sat opposite. Miss Marple, her auburn hair pinned more carefully today, though her eyes darted nervously to the windows. Major Reginald Blackwood, his military bearing undiminished by the early hour, attacked his plate with gusto, his fork clinking loudly against the porcelain. Dr. Simon Vale, arriving late, murmured an apology and took his seat. his spectacles glinting as he glanced at each face in turn. Mrs. Lydia Crane, the housekeeper, moved silently, refilling teacups with a deference that bordered on civility. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression serene but her senses alert. She noted the way Clara's hands trembled as she lifted her cup, the faint flush on Blackwood's cheeks when Evelyn mentioned the weather, and the brief, sharp look Vale exchanged with Mrs. Crane as she passed. The conversation was desultory remarks about the chill in the air, the state of the roads, but Miss Marple steered it gently toward the house itself. Such a grand place. Evelyn, she said, her voice mild. It must hold so many stories. Have you ever thought of writing its history? Evelyn's smile was strained. Oh, Jane, I'm no writer. And the Hall's stories are best left undisturbed. Too many shadows, you know, shadows. Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes bright with interest. Do you mean the architectural kind, or something more intangible? Clara set her cup down with a clatter, her face parling. It's her, isn't it? The widow in white. She's the shadow. Major Blackwood snorted, his moustache quivering. Nonsense, girl. Old houses make noises. Always have. You'd do well to ignore such fancies. But I've seen her, Clara insisted, her voice rising. Last night, after dinner, in the West Wing. She was standing by the staircase, her gown shimmering like frost. She looked right at me. Dr. Vale cleared his throat, adjusting his spectacles. Clara, my dear, you've been under strain. Lack of sleep can play tricks on the mind. Perhaps a mild sedative, no. Clara's eyes flashed, and she pushed back her chair. I'm not imagining it. I know what I saw. Evelyn reached for her daughter's hand, her own trembling. Clara, please. Let's not upset ourselves. Miss Marple observed the exchange, her knitting needles idle in her lap, but her mind weaving connections. Clara's fear was genuine, but was it born of a ghost or something more earthly? Blackwood's dismissal was too quick, too forceful, and Vale's suggestion of a sedative carried a hint of evasion. Mrs. Crane, silent through the outburst, slipped from the room, her apron strings knotted tightly as if to hold herself together. After breakfast, Evelyn invited Miss Marple to the drawing room, where the fire had been stoked but did little to warm the cavernous space. The portrait of Lord Harrow glared down, his eyes seeming to follow their movements. Evelyn sank into a chair, her handkerchief crumpled in her fist. Jane, I'm at my wit's end, she confessed. Clara's nerves are fraying, and I can't shake this feeling that the house is watching us. Those whispers, I heard them again last night, coming from the West Wing. Miss Marple nodded, her expression sympathetic but her thoughts sharp. Tell me more about the West Wing, Evelyn. Is it used at all? Hardly, Evelyn replied. It's mostly guest rooms, long empty. The servants avoid it, say it's too cold, too damp. But the whispers always come from there. And this widow in white, Miss Marple said, her tone conversational. What do the villagers say about her? Evelyn hesitated, her eyes flickering to the portrait. It's an old story, Jane. Lady Beatrice Harrow, married to my husband's uncle, Lord Edmund. She vanished on her wedding night, 50 years ago. Some say she fled with a lover, others that she met a darker fate. The villagers swear her ghost haunts the hall, seeking something, justice, perhaps, or her lost love. Miss Marple's needles resumed their clicking, a steady rhythm that belied the quickness of her thoughts. And what do you believe, Evelyn? I don't know, Evelyn admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. But I feel her, Jane. In the silence, in the shadows. It's as if she's trying to tell us something. Their conversation was interrupted by a sharp rap at the door. Mrs. Crane entered, her face pale. "Beg pardon, ma'am, but the vicar's here. Says he's heard talk in the village about disturbances at the hall. Wants to offer his prayers." Evelyn sighed, rising. "Show him in, Lydia. Jane, will you join us?" "Of course," Miss Marple said, tucking her knitting into her bag. The vicar, a wiry man named Mr. Pembroke, entered with a sombre air. His black cassock stark against the room's faded opulence. His condolences were perfunctory, his real purpose evident in his probing questions about the household's well-being. Miss Marple listened, her eyes noting his nervous habit of twisting his signet ring and the way his gaze lingered on the portrait. After the vicar left, promising to return with a prayer book, Miss Marple excused herself to explore the house. The west wing beckoned, its corridor dim and lined with portraits of long-dead Harrows, their eyes as cold as the stone walls. She moved silently, her sensible shoes muffled by the threadbare carpet. The air grew colder as she approached the staircase Clara had mentioned, and she paused, her hand resting on the banister. A faint scent lingered, lavender, perhaps, or something sweeter, like decayed roses. She examined the banister, noting a faint scuff mark, as if someone had gripped it too tightly. A door creaked behind her, and she turned to see Clara, her face pale but resolute. "Miss Marple, you're looking for her, aren't you?" the girl said, her voice low. "I can show you where I saw her last night." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes kind but searching. "That would be most helpful, Clara. Lead the way." Clara guided her to a narrow corridor, its walls papered in peeling silk. At the end was a door, slightly ajar, leading to an unused guest room. The air inside was stale, the furniture draped in dust sheets. Clara pointed to a corner near the window. "There," she whispered. She stood there, just watching me. Her face was so sad. Miss Marple crossed to the window, her eyes scanning the floor. A faint mark, barely visible, caught her attention. Smudge of chalk or ash, shaped like a half-moon. She knelt, her fingers brushing the mark, and noted a faint residue on her fingertips. "Interesting," she murmured, rising. "Clara, do you ever come to this room during the day?" "No," Clara said, shaking her head. "It's too eerie. I only came last night because I heard her voice." Miss Marple nodded, filing the information away. She led Clara back to the main house, her mind turning over the mark, the scent, the whispers. The west wing was a puzzle, its emptiness a facade for something hidden. She resolved to return after dark, when the house was quieter and its secrets less guarded. That afternoon, Miss Marple joined Evelyn for a walk in the garden, hoping to glean more about the household. The air was sharp, the sky bruised with clouds. Evelyn spoke of Clara's childhood, her love of music, her father's death. But when Miss Marple gently probed about Major Blackwood, Evelyn's answers grew vague. "He's an old friend," she said, her eyes on the horizon. "He visits when he's in the county. He's been kind." Miss Marple noted the hesitation, the way Evelyn's fingers tightened on her shawl. "And Dr. Vale?" she asked. "He seems very attentive." "Oh, Simon's a dear," Evelyn said quickly. "He's been our physician for years. Clara trusts him completely." They paused by the old well, its stone rim moss-covered and crumbling. Miss Marple peered into its depths, her eyes catching a faint glint far below. "Does anyone use this?" "Well," she asked. "No," Evelyn said, shivering. It's been dry for years. The gardeners say it's cursed. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Curses are often just stories, Evelyn, but stories can hide truths. That evening, dinner was a strained affair, the candles casting long shadows across the table. Major Blackwood dominated the conversation, his voice loud as he recounted a hunting trip in Scotland. Dr. Vale listened politely, his fingers tapping a rhythm on his glass. Clara ate little, her eyes fixed on her plate. Mrs. Crane served in silence, her movements jerky, as if startled by every sound. Miss Marple observed them all, her mind cataloguing their gestures, their silences. After dinner, she retired to her room but did not undress. Instead, she sat by the window, her knitting in her lap, her ears attuned to the house. At midnight, the whispers began again, faint but insistent, drifting from the west wing. She rose, slipping a shawl over her shoulders, and moved silently through the corridors. The west wing was darker now, the moonlight barely penetrating its narrow windows. She paused at the guest room, her hand on the doorknob, and listened. The whispers were clearer here, almost forming words. "Find me, please." She opened the door, her lamp casting a soft glow. The room was unchanged, the dust sheets undisturbed, but the air felt heavier, as if charged with expectation. She crossed to the window, her eyes scanning the floor. The chalk mark was gone, wiped clean, but the scent of lavender lingered, stronger now. She knelt, her fingers brushing the floorboards, and felt a faint seam, as if one were loose. With a gentle tug, she lifted it, revealing a small cavity. Inside was a single pearl earring, its luster dulled by time. Miss Marple slipped the earring into her pocket, her heart quickening. It was no ghost's trinket, but a clue, solid and real. She replaced the floorboard and stood, her mind racing. The whispers, the widow, the earring Harrow Hall was speaking, and she was listening. Tomorrow, she would speak to Mrs. Crane, whose nervous glances suggested a knowledge she could not conceal. For now, she returned to her room, her step silent, her resolve firm. The shadow of Harrow Hall was long, but Miss Marple was no stranger to shadows, and she knew how to bring them into the light. Chapter 3. The tale of the widow. The morning light filtered through the heavy drapes of Harrow Hall, casting a muted glow across the breakfast room where Miss Jane Marple sat, her teacup cradled in her hands. The air was sharp with the scent of toast and kippers, but an undercurrent of unease lingered, as palpable as the damp that clung to the hall's ancient walls. Miss Marple's eyes, bright behind her silver spectacles, moved from face to face, noting the subtle shifts in demeanor. Among the household, Evelyn Harrow, at the head of the table, wore a strained smile, her fingers smoothing the edge of a napkin with mechanical precision. Clara, pale and silent, pushed her food around her plate, her gaze fixed on some unseen point beyond the window. Major Reginald Blackwood, his military bluster softened by the early hour, sipped his coffee with a frown, his eyes flickering to the door as if expecting an interruption. Dr. Simon Vale, arriving with an air of distracted courtesy, adjusted his spectacles and murmured pleasantries, but his hands betrayed a slight tremor. Mrs. Lydia Crane, the housekeeper, moved with her usual efficiency, though her lips were pressed into a thin line, as if guarding a secret she dared not voice. Miss Marple, her knitting bag at her feet, steered the conversation toward the history of Harrow Hall, her tone light but deliberate. "Such a splendid house must have a rich past," she remarked, her eyes on Evelyn. "Clara mentioned a story yesterday about a Lady Beatrice, was it? The widow in white." Clara's fork clattered against her plate, and she looked up, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and fascination. Yes, Miss Marple, she's the one. I saw everyone in the village knows her story. Major Blackwood snorted, his moustache twitching. Village gossip, nothing more. Every old pile like this has its ghost story. Keeps the maids entertained. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of polite curiosity. Perhaps, Major, but stories often have a kernel of truth. Clara dear, would you share what you know? I'm all ears. Clara glanced at her mother, who nodded reluctantly, and began, her voice low but steady. Lady Beatrice Harrow was married to my great-uncle, Lord Edmund Harrow, in 1875. She was young, barely 18, and beautiful, they say, with hair like spun gold and eyes like the sea. But the marriage was unhappy. Lord Edmund was older, stern, and cruel, some said. On their wedding night, Beatrice vanished. No one knows what happened. The villagers say she ran off with a lover, a young artist who'd been painting her portrait. Others say Lord Edmund did away with her in a fit of rage. Her body was never found, but her white wedding gown was seen in the West Wing, floating through the corridors. That's why they call her the Widow in White, even though she was only a bride. Evelyn's face tightened, and she reached for Clara's hand. It's just a story, darling. You mustn't let it upset you. But I've seen her, Mother, Clara insisted, her voice rising, and the whispers, they're hers. I know it. Dr. Vale cleared his throat, his tone measured. Clara, these old tales can prey on the mind, especially in a house like this. The wind, the creaking timbers, it's easy to mistake them for something more. Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking softly as she resumed her knitting. Quite so, Doctor. But it's curious, isn't it, how persistent these stories are. And the whispers, Evelyn, you've heard them too, you said. Evelyn hesitated, her eyes darting to the portrait of Lord Harrow above the mantel, its stern gaze seeming to weigh on the room. Yes, she admitted. At night, mostly, they seem to come from the West Wing, but when I go to look, there's nothing. Just silence. Major Blackwood set his cup down with a thud. Enough of this nonsense. If there's whispering, it's likely a servant sneaking about or a draught through a cracked window. I'll have a look myself tonight, put an end to this foolishness. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her face remained serene. That's very kind of you, Major. I'm sure we'd all rest easier knowing the matter's been investigated. Breakfast ended, and the household dispersed, Evelyn to her correspondence, Clara to her music room, Blackwood to the library with a newspaper, and Vale to his medical bag, murmuring about a patient in the village. Miss Marple, however, had other plans. The tale of Beatrice Harrow, though cloaked in the trappings of a ghost story, had the ring of something more tangibly tragedy unresolved, its echoes lingering in the hall's shadowed corners. She decided to explore the West Wing again, this time in daylight, to see what secrets it might yield. The corridor was as dim as the previous evening, its air heavy with dust and the faint scent of lavender she'd noticed before. She moved slowly, her eyes scanning the walls, the floor, the faded portraits of Harrow ancestors. At the guest room where Clara had seen the apparition, she paused, her hand resting on the doorknob. The room was unchanged, its dust sheets ghostly in their own right, but the floorboard she'd lifted the night before caught her attention. She knelt, her fingers tracing the seam, and lifted it again. The cavity was empty, the pearl earring she'd found now safely tucked in her knitting bag. but the board itself was curious. Its edges were worn, as if lifted often, and a faint scratch marked its underside, as if something had been dragged across it. Rising, she crossed to the window where the chalk mark had been. The floor was clean now, but a faint residue clung to the baseboard, barely visible in the dim light. She scraped a sample onto a handkerchief, noting its powdery texture. Not chalk, she thought, but something finer, like talc or ash. She tucked the handkerchief away, her mind turning over possibilities. A ghost might leave whispers, but not powder, not earrings, not scratches on wood. As she left the room, she nearly collided with Mrs. Crane, who was carrying a stack of linens, her face pale and her eyes wide. "Oh, Miss Marple, I didn't see you there," the housekeeper stammered, her hands tightening on the linens. "No harm done, Mrs. Crane," Miss Marple said, her tone soothing. "I was just admiring the house. The West Wing is quite atmospheric, don't you think?" Mrs. Crane's lips twitched, as if she wanted to speak but thought better of it. "It's cold, ma'am, and damp. Best to stay in the main house." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her eyes noting the housekeeper's knotted apron strings and the faint tremor in her voice. "You must know the hall well, having been here so long. Did you ever hear stories about Lady Beatrice?" Mrs. Crane's eyes darted to the corridor, then back to Miss Marple. "Just what everyone knows, ma'am. A sad tale, but long past. If you'll excuse me, I've work to do." She hurried off, her footsteps echoing in the stillness. Miss Marple watched her go, her mind cataloguing the housekeeper's evasions. Mrs. Crane knew more than she was saying, and her nervousness suggested a burden she carried unwillingly. Returning to the main house, Miss Marple found Clara in the music room, seated at a pianoforte, her fingers faltering over a melancholy waltz. The girl looked up, her face brightening. "Slightly, Miss Marple, I didn't hear you come in." "I move quietly," Miss Marple said, smiling. "You play beautifully, Clara. Does music help with your nerves?" "Sometimes," Clara said, her hands resting on the keys. "But not when I think of her, the widow. I can't stop seeing her face so pale, so sad." Miss Marple sat beside her, her knitting bag at her side. "Tell me, Clara, have you ever seen anything else unusual in the West Wing? Objects out of place, perhaps, or marks on the floor?" Clara frowned, her fingers tracing a key. "There was something, a few weeks ago. A handkerchief, embroidered with a bee, lying near the staircase. I thought it was Mother's, but she said it wasn't. I left it there, but it was gone the next day." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking softly. "And the whispers, too. They ever say anything clear?" Clara shivered. "Once, I thought I heard betrayed, but it was so faint I might have imagined it." They were interrupted by Major Blackwood, who strode in with his newspaper tucked under his arm. "Still talking ghosts, are we?" he said, his tone gruff but his eyes uneasy. "Clara, you'd do better to practice your scales than dwell on such rot." Clara flushed, her hands dropping to her lap. Miss Marple smiled placidly. "Music is a great comfort, Major, and stories, even ghostly ones, can reveal much about a place, don't you agree?" He grunted, his gaze shifting to the window. "I'll be checking the West Wing tonight. If there's anything amiss, I'll find it." "I'm sure you will," Miss Marple said, her voice mild but her eyes sharp. She noted the way his hand tightened on his newspaper, the faint sheen of sweat on his brow despite the room's chill. That afternoon, Miss Marple took tea with Evelyn. In the drawing room, where the fire crackled but failed to warm the air, she steered the conversation to the household's routines, probing gently for insights into its dynamics. Evelyn spoke of Clara's sensitivity, Blackwood's loyalty, Vale's kindness, but her answers grew vague when Miss Marple asked about Mrs. Crane's history with the family. "Lydia's been with us since before I came to the hall," Evelyn said, her eyes on her teacup. "She was devoted to my husband's uncle, Lord Edmund. I think Beatrice's disappearance broke her heart." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking. "It must have been a difficult time for everyone. Were there ever any clues about what happened to Beatrice?" Evelyn shook her head. "Nothing certain. A few of her things were found ashore, a glove but no trace of her. The police searched the estate, even the well, but found nothing." Miss Marple's eyes flickered with interest, but she kept her tone light. "The well, that's an odd place to look." "It was a theory," Evelyn said quickly. "Some thought she might have fallen in, but it was dry even then." Their conversation was cut short by Dr. Vale's arrival, his medical bag in hand. "Evelyn, I've brought something for Clara's nerves," he said, producing a small vial. "Just a mild tonic, nothing strong." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the vial, its amber liquid catching the firelight. "Very thoughtful, doctor," she said. "You take such care with the family." He smiled, but his eyes were guarded. "It's my duty, Miss Marple. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have rounds to make." As he left, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the well, the handkerchief, the earring, the powder. Each was a thread in a larger pattern, one she was beginning to discern. That evening, she resolved to keep watch again, but from a new vantage point, the library, which overlooked the garden and the well. She settled into a high-backed chair, her knitting in her lap, a single lamp casting a soft glow. The house was quiet, save for the occasional creak, but as midnight approached, the whispers began again. Drifting from the west wing like a mournful song, she rose, her shawl draped over her shoulders, and moved to the window. The garden was bathed in moonlight, the well a dark silhouette against the silvered grass. A figure moved near it, too tall for Clara, to lean for Blackwood. She squinted, recognizing Dr. Vale's silhouette as he paused by the well, his head bowed as if in thought. He lingered only a moment before disappearing into the shadows. Miss Marple returned to her chair, her mind racing. The tale of the widow was no mere ghost story, was a wound, unhealed, its pain echoing through the hall. The earring, the powder, the whispers, they pointed to a truth, buried but not forgotten. She would speak to Mrs. Crane tomorrow, pressing gently on the housekeeper's fragile composure. For now, she knitted, her needles steady, her thoughts as sharp as the moonlight that pierced Harrow Hall's shadows. Chapter 4. A discovery in the attic. The dawn broke over Harrow Hall with a reluctant light, the sky bruised with clouds that promised rain. Miss Jane Marple, already dressed in her sensible tweed and a dove-grey blouse, stood at her bedroom window, her eyes tracing the garden where Dr. Vale had lingered by the well the previous night. The memory of his silhouette, furtive and solitary, lingered in her mind, as did the pearl earring now tucked in her knitting bag, its luster a silent accusation. The whispers she'd heard again at midnight, faint, pleading, almost articulate, strengthened her resolve. Harrow Hall was no mere haunted house. It was a repository of secrets, and she was determined to unearth them. Breakfast was a subdued affair, the dining room heavy with the scent of porridge and strong tea. Evelyn Harrow, her face etched with sleeplessness, presided with a fragile dignity, her hands folding and unfolding a napkin. Clara, pale as porcelain, nibbled at a slice of toast, her eyes darting to the windows, as if expecting the widow in white to appear in daylight. Major Reginald Blackwood, his bluster muted by the morning's gloom, read a newspaper with exaggerated focus, though Miss Marple noted his fingers tightening on the pages when Clara mentioned the West Wing. Dr. Simon Vale was absent, having left early for a patient in the village, or so Mrs. Crane had said as she served the meal with her usual nervous efficiency. The housekeeper's eyes, red-rimmed and evasive, avoided Miss Marple's gaze, and her apron strings were knotted even tighter than before. Miss Marple, her knitting bag at her side, steered the conversation to the hall's history, her tone as light as a summer breeze. "Evelyn, you mentioned the West Wing is rarely used," she said, buttering a scone. "What of the attic? Surely a house this old has one, full of forgotten treasures." Evelyn's smile was thin, her eyes flickering to the ceiling. "Oh yes, there's an attic, but it's a dreadful place, dusty, cramped, full of old junk. I haven't been up there in years." Clara looked up, her voice hesitant. "I went once, when I was a child. There were trunks and old dresses, but it felt wrong, like I was trespassing." Major Blackwood folded his newspaper with a snap. "Attics are for spiders and broken furniture, nothing more. You'd do better to stay out of them, Clara." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. "Perhaps, Major, but old things can tell such interesting stories, don't you think?" He grunted, his gaze shifting to his coffee cup, and Miss Marple noted the faint flush on his neck, a sign of discomfort he couldn't quite conceal. She resolved to visit the attic that morning, sensing it might hold more than cobwebs and discarded relics. After breakfast, she excused herself, claiming a need for a quiet walk to clear her head. Instead, she made her way to the upper floors, following a narrow staircase tucked behind a faded tapestry in the east wing. The air grew mustier as she climbed, the scent of damp wood mingling with something sweeter, like old lavender sachet, left to decay. The attic door was heavy oak, its hinges protesting as she pushed it open. Inside, a single dormer window cast a feeble light, illuminating a chaos of trunks, crates, and shrouded furniture. Dust motes danced in the air, and the floorboards creaked under her sensible shoes. Miss Marple moved carefully, her eyes scanning the clutter. A cracked mirror reflected her silhouette, and a dressmaker's dummy stood like a silent sentinel. In one corner, she began with the trunks, their leather cracked and buckles rusted, lifting lids to reveal yellowed linens, moth-eaten shawls, and a child's christening gown, its lace brittle as autumn leaves. One trunk, pushed against the far wall, caught her attention. Its lock was newer, its surface less dusty, as if it had been opened recently. She knelt, her fingers probing the lock, and with a hairpin from her bun, she coaxed it open with a soft click. Inside was a treasure trove of papers, letters, sketches, and a small leather-bound diary embossed with the initials B.H. Miss. Marple's heart quickened as she lifted the diary, its pages brittle but intact. She opened it carefully, the faint scent of ink and lavender rising from the pages. The entries, written in a flowing hand, chronicled the final months of Lady Beatrice Harrow's life. They spoke of her joy at her betrothal, her growing unease with Lord Edmund's temper, and her secret meetings with a man she called my heart's refuge. The final entry, dated the night of her wedding, was stark. "He knows. I saw it in his eyes tonight, cold and cruel. My heart's refuge urges me to flee, but I fear it's too late. If I am lost, let this diary speak for me." Miss Marple closed the diary, her mind racing. Beatrice had feared for her life, and the he was likely Lord Edmund, though the lover's identity was a mystery. She tucked the diary into her shawl, intending to read it fully later, and continued her search. Beneath a pile of letters, she found a faded photograph of a young woman in a white gown, her face serene but her eyes haunted. The resemblance to Clara was striking, though the photograph was clearly decades old. On its back, in the same flowing hand, was written, "Beatrice, 1875. As she replaced the trunk's contents, a faint sound reached her, a scuffle, like footsteps retreating down the stairs. She moved to the door, her lamp casting long shadows. But the staircase was empty. Someone had been watching, she was certain, and the thought sharpened her senses. She descended carefully, her hand on the banister, and returned to the main house, where the morning's quiet was broken by the clatter of dishes from the kitchen at luncheon. The atmosphere was taut, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Clara was absent, resting in her room, Evelyn said, her voice tinged with worry. Major Blackwood was jovial, regaling them with a story of a tiger hunt. But his laughter rang hollow, and Miss Marple noted his eyes darting to the door whenever footsteps approached. Dr. Vale, who had returned from the village, was subdued, his fingers adjusting his spectacles with mechanical precision. Mrs. Crane served in silence, her face pale, her hands trembling as she poured wine. Miss Marple, her thoughts on the diary, steered the conversation to the past. "Evelyn, you must have heard so many stories about the Hall's early days," she said, her tone conversational. "Did Lord Edmund ever speak of his first wife, Beatrice?" Evelyn's fork paused midway to her mouth. "Not often," she said, her voice low. "He was a private man, and Beatrice's disappearance was a wound, I think. He never remarried." Blackwood cleared his throat, his tone brusque. "Old scandals are best left buried, Miss Marple. No sense stirring up trouble." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. "But history has a way of lingering, doesn't it? Like a scent you can't quite place." Dr. Vale's eyes met hers briefly, then dropped to his plate. "The past is a heavy burden," he murmured, almost to himself. After luncheon, Miss Marple retired to her room, where she read Beatrice's diary by the light of her lamp. The entries painted a vivid picture, a young woman trapped in a marriage of convenience, her heart belonging to another, her fear growing as her husband's. Jealousy darkened. One entry mentioned a hiding place in the West Wing, where my secrets are safe. Miss Marple made a note to search there again, suspecting the earring was only the beginning. That evening, as the household gathered in the drawing room, Miss Marple observed them closely. Clara, who had joined them, sat near the fire, her hands clasped tightly. Blackwood paced, his cigar smoke curling in the air. Vale sat with a book, though his eyes rarely left the page. Evelyn, her embroidery neglected, stared into the flames. Mrs. Crane, entering to clear the tea things, dropped a saucer, her gasp echoing in the silence. Miss Marple, her knitting needles clicking, broke the tension. "Major, did you investigate the West Wing last night, as you planned?" He started, his cigar nearly dropping. Yes. Nothing there but dust and shadows." "Told you it was nonsense." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her tone mild. "But I thought I heard footsteps myself, near the attic stairs this morning." Mrs. Crane froze, her hands clutching the tray. "The attic, ma'am. No one goes there." It's locked." "Oh, I found it open," Miss Marple said, her eyes on the housekeeper. "Such an interesting place, full of history." Mrs. Crane's face paled, and she hurried from the room. Miss Marple's needles clicked faster, her mind weaving a pattern from the diary, the earring, the footsteps. Someone in the house knew more than they admitted, and the attic's secrets were only the beginning. That night, she resolved to watch the West Wing again, suspecting the whispers would lead her closer to the truth. As she retired, the house seemed to hum with anticipation, its shadows deepening, its secrets waiting to be uncovered. Chapter 5. The Major's alibi. The morning at Harrow Hall dawned with a sullen drizzle, the rain tapping against the windows like impatient fingers. Miss Jane Marple, seated at the breakfast table, observed the household through the soft clink of porcelain and the murmur of strained pleasantries. The air was heavy with the scent of damp wool and boiled eggs, but an undercurrent of tension wove through the room, sharper than the previous days. Evelyn Harrow, her face pale and her hands restless, presided over the meal with a forced calm, her eyes flickering to the empty chair where Clara usually sat. Major Reginald Blackwood, his military posture rigid, buttered his toast with unnecessary vigor, his moustache twitching as he avoided direct gazes. Dr. Simon Vale, present despite an early call to the village, sipped his tea with a distracted air, his spectacles fogging slightly from the steam. Mrs. Lydia Crane, the housekeeper, moved with a jerky precision, her apron strings knotted so tightly they seemed to cut into her waist. Miss Marple, her knitting bag at her feet, noted the absence of Clara and inquired gently, "Is Clara unwell this morning, Evelyn?" Evelyn's smile was brittle. "She's resting, Jane." The whispers kept her awake again. "I've asked Dr. Vale to look in on her later." Vale nodded, his voice smooth but guarded. "Just a touch of nerves, I expect. A tonic will set her right." Major Blackwood snorted, his knife scraping against his plate. "Nerves. The girl needs to stop this ghost nonsense. It's wearing us all thin." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles, though her expression remained serene. "It's a trying time for her, Major. Young people are so sensitive to atmosphere. But you must have seen your share of unsettling places in your travels. India, wasn't it?" Blackwood's hand paused, his knife hovering. "Yes, India. Hot, dusty, full of superstition. Nothing like this damp old pile, but I've seen worse." "I'm sure you have," Miss Marple said, her tone light but probing. "You must have stories of narrow escapes and clever alibis from your campaigns." He grunted, his eyes narrowing. "Alibis. Never needed them. A soldier's life is straightforward orders action, no time for skulking about." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her needles clicking softly as she resumed her knitting. "Though houses like this do make one wonder about comings and goings, don't you think?" Blackwood's flush deepened, and he pushed back his chair, muttering about needing air. Miss Marple watched him go, noting the stiffness in his stride, as if he were marching to a battle he'd rather avoid. Her mind turned to the diary in her shawl, its final entry echoing, "He knows, I fear for my life." Was Blackwood the he Beatrice feared, or was he merely a blustering bystander caught in the hall's web of secrets? After breakfast, Miss Marple found Clara in the music room, seated at the pianoforte, but not playing, her hands folded in her lap. The girl's face was drawn, her eyes shadowed, but she brightened slightly at Miss Marple's approach. "Miss Marple, I'm so glad you're here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I saw her again last night, the widow. She was by the well this time, just standing there. Miss Marple sat beside her, her knitting bag at her side. The well, you say? That's curious. Did you notice anything else, Clara? Perhaps someone else nearby? Clara frowned, her fingers twisting together. I think I saw the Major. He was pacing near the well, looking angry. I didn't stay long, I was too frightened. Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloguing the detail. You did well to tell me, Clara. Now, try to rest. Music might soothe you. As Clara began a halting melody, Miss Marple excused herself and made her way to the library, where she'd seen Blackwood retreat. The room was dim, its shelves lined with leather-bound volumes, their spines cracked from neglect. Blackwood stood by the fireplace, staring into the flames, a half-burned photograph in the grate catching Miss Marple's eye. She approached, her steps soft, and glimpsed the image before it crumbled to asher younger Blackwood, his arm around a woman whose face bore a striking resemblance to Beatrice Harrow. Good morning, Major, she said, her tone cheerful. I hope I'm not disturbing you. I was just admiring the library. Such a wealth of history. He started, his hand jerking to his pocket. Miss Marple didn't hear you come in. Yes, fine old room, though it's seen better days. Like so much of the hall, she said, her eyes on the fireplace. I noticed you were burning something. Old letters, perhaps. I find them so evocative of the past. His face reddened, and he coughed. Just rubbish. Old photograph. Nothing important. Keeps the fire going. Of course, Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. Though photographs can be such treasures. Was it from your time in India? No, he said quickly, too quickly. Just something I found here. Clutter, you know. She nodded, her needles clicking as she sat in a nearby chair. You must have known the Harrows well, being such a close friend of Evelyn's late husband. Did you ever meet Lady Beatrice? Blackwood's eyes narrowed, but he forced a laugh. Before my time, I'm afraid. I only knew Edmund later, after the war. Sad business, her disappearance, but old news. Indeed, Miss Marple said, her tone mild, though it's curious how old news can stir things up, isn't it? Like those whispers Clara hears. He turned away, his hand gripping the mantel. I've told you, it's just the house, settling. I checked the west wing myself. Nothing there. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on his knuckles, white against the dark wood. How thorough of you, she said, rising. I mustn't keep you from your reading. She left the library, her mind buzzing. The photograph, half-burned but unmistakable, linked Blackwood to Beatrice, or someone very like her. His haste to destroy it suggested a connection he wished to conceal, and Clara's sighting of him by the well, pacing and angry, was no coincidence. Miss Marple resolved to investigate the well herself, suspecting it held more than village superstitions. That afternoon, the rain had eased, leaving the garden sodden and gleaming. Miss Marple, her shawl draped over her shoulders, made her way to the well, its stone rim slick with moss. She leaned over, her eyes straining in the dim light, and caught the glint she'd noticed before, metallic shimmer, deep in the shaft. It was too far to reach, but its presence confirmed her suspicions. Something had been hidden there, deliberately or in haste. As she straightened, she heard a rustle in the shrubbery. Turning, she glimpsed Dr. Vale retreating toward the house, his coat damp and his steps hurried. She made a mental note to question him later, his nocturnal wanderings by the well too frequent to be innocent. For now, she returned to the hall, where Evelyn was in the drawing room, her embroidery lying untouched. "Jane, you've been out in this weather," Evelyn said, her voice tinged with concern. "You'll catch your death." "Just a short walk," Miss Marple said, settling into a chair. "The garden is lovely, even in the rain. That well, though it's quite a feature. Has it ever been searched properly?" Evelyn's hands stilled, her needle poised above the fabric. "Searched, not since Beatrice's time." The police looked, but it was dry, empty. "Why do you ask?" "Just curiosity," Miss Marple said, her tone light. "Old wells have such stories, don't they?" Evelyn nodded, her eyes distant. "The villagers say it's cursed, but I never believed it. Still, it's an eerie place." Their conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Crane, who entered with a tray of tea, her face pale and her hands trembling. As she set the tray down, a cup rattled, and she muttered an apology. Miss Marple watched her closely, noting the way her eyes darted to Evelyn, then away. "Mrs. Crane," she said gently, "you must have been here when Beatrice disappeared. It must have been a terrible shock." The housekeeper froze, her hands clutching the tray. "It was, ma'am, a sad time. I don't like to speak of it." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her smile sympathetic. "But if you ever recall anything, even a small detail, it might help ease Clara's fears." Mrs. Crane nodded curtly and fled the room, her footsteps echoing in the hall. Miss Marple's needles clicked faster, her mind weaving the threads of the diary. The photograph, the well, and Blackwood's unease. His alibi checking the west wing and finding nothing was too convenient. His denial of knowing Beatrice, too emphatic. That evening, as the household gathered for dinner, Miss Marple observed Blackwood closely. He was quieter, his bluster replaced by a forced joviality, and his eyes avoided hers. Clara, pale but composed, mentioned seeing the Major by the well again, her voice trembling. Blackwood's fork clattered, and he coughed, claiming a bit of food had caught in his throat. Vale, seated across from him, offered a glass of water, his expression unreadable. After dinner, Miss Marple retired to the library, her knitting in hand, and positioned herself by the window overlooking the garden. The rain had stopped, and the moonlight silvered the well, its rim gleaming like a warning. She waited, her senses alert and just past police. She saw Blackwood slip out of the house, his coat pulled tight, and head toward the well. He paused, looking around, then dropped something small into the shaft, a glint of metal, perhaps, or fabric. Miss Marple's heart quickened. The Major's alibi was unraveling, and the well, she suspected, held the key to Beatrice's fate. She would need to act carefully, but the truth was closer, hidden in the shadows of Harrow Hall. Chapter 6. The doctor's secret. The rain had returned to Harrow Hall by morning. A steady patter that cloaked the estate in a grey veil and deepened the chill within its walls. Miss Jane Marple sat at the breakfast table, her hands folded round. A cup of tea, her eyes quietly assessing the subdued gathering. The air was thick with the scent of damp stone and bacon, but the atmosphere was heavier, strained by the unspoken weight of the previous night's observations. Evelyn Harrow, her face drawn and her fingers nervously tracing the rim of her saucer, presided with a faltering attempt at composure. Clara, pale and silent, stared at her untouched plate, her eyes shadowed by sleeplessness. Major Reginald Blackwood, his military bluster dimmed, ate mechanically, his gaze fixed on the rain-streaked window. Dr. Simon Vale, however, was the focus of Miss Marple's attention this morning. His absence from breakfast, announced by Mrs. Crane as a late call to A patient seemed convenient after his nocturnal visit to the well. The housekeeper herself moved with a jittery haste. Her apron strings knotted tightly, her eyes avoiding Miss Marple's as she cleared the dishes. Miss Marple, her knitting bag at her feet, stirred her tea thoughtfully, her mind turning over. The glint of metal ore, perhaps fabric she had seen Blackwood drop into the well, and the fleeting glimpse of Dr. Vale's silhouette there the night before. The diary of Lady Beatrice Harrow, safely hidden in her shawl, had hinted at a trusted friend who betrayed her, and Vale's guarded demeanor, coupled with his late-night wanderings, suggested he might be more than the solicitous physician. He appeared. She resolved to follow him that evening, suspecting his secret was a thread in the unraveling tapestry of Harrow Hall's mystery. "Evelyn," Miss Marple said, her tone light as she broke the silence. "Dr. Vale seems very dedicated, always rushing off to patients. He must know the village as well as you do." Evelyn's smile was thin, her fingers tightening on her saucer. "Oh yes, Simon's been our physician for years. He's a comfort, especially to Clara." Clara looked up, her voice barely audible. "He's kind, but I don't like his tonics. They make me feel strange, like I'm not myself." Major Blackwood grunted, his fork pausing. "Tonics, overprescribed nonsense. A brisk walk would do you more good, girl." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. "Perhaps, Major, though a doctor's care can reveal much about a household, don't you think? Their visits, their remedies, it's all quite telling." Blackwood's flush deepened, and he muttered something about the weather, his eyes darting to the door. Miss Marple noted his discomfort, but her thoughts were on Vale, whose absence felt deliberate, a shield against scrutiny. She excused herself. After breakfast, claiming a need to write letters, but instead slipped into the garden, her shawl drawn against the drizzle. The well, its mossy rim slick with rain, beckoned. She peered into its depths, the glint she'd seen still visible, but unreachable without tools. She made a mental note to ask the gardener for a hook or rope, though she suspected any request would draw attention. Returning to the house, she found Clara in the drawing room, curled in a chair with a book she wasn't reading. "Miss Marple," Clara said, her voice trembling, "I heard the whispers again last night, clearer this time. They said, 'Help me.' It was her, I know it." Miss Marple sat beside her, her knitting needles clicking softly. "You're very brave to listen. Clara, did you see anything else? Perhaps someone moving about?" Clara frowned, her fingers twisting a loose thread on her sleeve. "I saw Dr. Vale, late, near the greenhouse. He was carrying something, a box, I think. He looked frightened." Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her expression remained serene. "The greenhouse, you say? That's curious. Perhaps he was checking on some plants." Clara shook her head. "He wasn't gardening. He was digging, I think. I didn't stay to watch, I was too scared." Miss Marple patted her hand, her mind cataloguing the detail. The greenhouse, like the well, was an odd place for a doctor to linger at night. She resolved to investigate it that evening, when the household was asleep. For now, she steered Clara toward lighter topics, coaxing a faint smile with tales of village fates back in St. Mary's Hollow. That afternoon, Dr. Vale returned, his coat damp and his manner distracted. He joined Evelyn and Miss Marple for tea in the drawing room, his spectacles fogging as he warmed his hands by the fire. "A trying morning," he said, his voice smooth but strained. "Old Mrs. Tanner in the village, she's taken a turn." "Sorry to hear that," Miss Marple said, her tone sympathetic. "You must cover quite a distance in your rounds, Doctor. Do you ever walk the grounds here at night? The gardens are so peaceful under the moon. Vale's hand paused on his teacup, his eyes flickering to hers. Rarely, Miss Marple. I prefer to stay indoors after dark. The horse paths are treacherous in the wet. Of course, she said, her smile disarming. Though I thought I saw someone by the greenhouse last night. Perhaps it was one of the gardeners. His smile was tight, his fingers adjusting. His spectacles, likely. They're always tending to something, even in this weather. Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking faster. His denial was too quick, his composure too carefully maintained. She changed the subject, asking about his medical practice, but her mind was on the greenhouse and the box Clara had seen. After tea, she excused herself and slipped into the library, where she pored over Beatrice's diary again. One entry, dated a week before the wedding, caught her eye. My friend promises to keep my secrets safe, hidden where no one looks. But I fear his kindness masks a price I cannot pay. The friend could be Vale, or someone close to him, perhaps even Blackwood, though the diary's tone suggested trust turned to betrayal. Miss Marple tucked the diary away, her thoughts turning to the greenhouse. She would need to move carefully, as the household was growing wary, their glances sharper, their silences heavier. That evening, after a tense dinner where forced cheer grated against Clara's silence, Miss Marple waited until the house settled. At 11, she donned her shawl and slipped into the garden, her lamp dimmed to avoid notice. The greenhouse loomed in the moonlight, its glass panes misted with condensation. She moved silently, her sensible shoes sinking into the damp earth, and peered through a cracked pane. Inside, the air was humid, thick with the scent of loam and ferns. A patch of earth near the back was disturbed, as if recently turned. She eased the door open, her heart steady despite the darkness, and knelt by the patch. Her fingers brushed the soil, unearthing a small tin box. Its lid rusted but intact. With a gentle tug, she opened it, revealing a locket inscribed with BH, and a vial of clear liquid. It scent sharp and medicinal laudanum, she suspected. From her knowledge of village apothecaries, the locket held a miniature portrait of Beatrice, her face serene but her eyes haunted, matching the photograph from the attic. Miss Marple slipped the box into her shawl, her mind racing. Why had Vale hidden this here, and what was the laudanum's purpose? Beatrice's diary had mentioned no illness, only fear as she replaced the soil. A shadow moved outside, and she froze, her lamp extinguished. Footsteps crunched on the gravel, then stopped. She waited, her breath shallow, until the sound retreated. Rising, she slipped back to the house, her heart pounding but her resolve firm. The box was a clue, as solid as the earring, and it pointed to Vale as more than a bystander in Beatrice's fate in her room. She examined the locket by lamplight, noting a faint scratch on its clasp, as if forced open. The laudanum vial was half empty, its cork worn, suggesting frequent use. She recalled Clara's dislike of Vale's tonics and wondered if he had a habit of prescribing such remedies too freely. The whispers, clearer now, seemed to echo from the diary. Find me. Miss Marple tucked the box into her knitting bag, beside the earring and diary, and made a note in her notebook. Vale greenhouse, laudanum, locket, motive. The house was silent now, save for the rain's soft drumbeat, but Miss Marple knew sleep would elude her. Vale's secret was a piece of the puzzle, but it was not the whole. Blackwood's actions by the well, Mrs. Crane's evasions, Clara's visions, they all wove together. a pattern emerging in the shadows of Harrow Hall. Tomorrow, she would press Vale gently, perhaps catch him off guard. For now, she sat by her window, her knitting idle, her eyes on the garden where the greenhouse stood like a silent witness to the doctor's secret. Chapter 7. The Housekeeper's Tale, The Morning at Harrow. Hall was cloaked in a fog, so thick it seemed to seep into the very walls, muffling sound and shrouding the estate in an eerie stillness. Miss Jane Marple sat at the breakfast table, her hands folded neatly round her teacup, her eyes quietly observing the strained faces around her. The air carried the faint scent of damp plaster and poached eggs, but the atmosphere was heavy with unspoken fears, sharper now than ever. Evelyn Harrow, her face pale and her hands fidgeting with a silver spoon, presided with a weary dignity, her eyes darting to the empty chair where Clara should have been. Major Reginald Blackwood, his military bluster subdued, poked at his plate with a fork, his moustache twitching as if irritated by his own thoughts. Dr. Simon Vale, present despite his usual morning rounds, sipped his coffee with a distracted air, his spectacles glinting as he avoided direct gazes. Mrs. Lydia Crane, the housekeeper, moved with a nervous haste. Her apron strings knotted so tightly they seemed to bite into her thin frame, her eyes resolutely fixed on her tasks. Miss Marple, her knitting bag at her feet, noted Clara's absence and the housekeeper's agitation, which seemed to have deepened since yesterday. The tin box from the greenhouse containing Beatrice's locket and the vial of laudanum lay hidden in her shawl, alongside the pearl earring and the diary. The diary's cryptic entries, particularly the mention of a trusted friend turned betrayer, pointed to secrets buried deep within the household, and Mrs. Crane's evasive glances suggested she held a piece of that puzzle. Miss Marple resolved to speak with her alone, sensing the housekeeper's fragile composure might yield under gentle pressure. "Evelyn," Miss Marple said, her tone light as she broke the silence, "Clara seems to be resting again this morning. I do hope she's feeling better." Evelyn's smile was strained, her fingers tightening on her spoon. "She's still shaken, Jane. Those whispers, she says, they were louder last night, almost like words. I've asked Dr. Vale to check on her again." Vale nodded, his voice smooth but cautious. "A touch of exhaustion, I expect. I'll adjust her tonic. Rest is the best remedy." Blackwood snorted, his fork clattering against his plate. "Rest. The girl needs to stop this ghost nonsense. It's unsettling the whole house." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles, though her expression remained serene. "It's a trying time, Major. Old houses like this do have a way of stirring the imagination. Mrs. Crane, you must have seen many a young girl come and go in this house over the years. Do these stories ever remind you of the past?" Mrs. Crane, who was refilling the teapot, froze, her hands trembling so violently that a few drops spilled. "I don't know what you mean, ma'am," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Old stories are just that, stories." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her tone soothing but her eyes sharp, "though I imagine you've heard your share, working here so long. You must have known Lady Beatrice, perhaps." The housekeeper's face paled, and she set the teapot down with a clatter, muttering an apology. "I was young then, ma'am, just a maid. It was a sad time, but I don't recall much." She hurried from the room, her footsteps echoing in the corridor. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind cataloguing the housekeeper's reaction. Mrs. Crane's denial was too quick, her nervousness too pronounced. She knew something, perhaps more than she dared admit, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover it. After breakfast, Miss Marple found an opportunity to follow Mrs. Crane to the pantry, a small, cluttered room off the kitchen where the housekeeper was sorting linens. The air was thick with the scent of starch and lavender, and the dim light cast long shadows across the shelves. Mrs. Crane started as Miss Marple entered, her hands clutching a folded tablecloth. "Oh, Miss Marple," she exclaimed, her voice high. "I didn't hear you." "I move quietly," Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. "I hope I'm not interrupting, Mrs. Crane. I was just admiring the order you nipping here. You keep the house so well." Despite its size, Mrs. Crane's lips twitched, as if unsure whether to smile or flee. "It's my duty, ma'am." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, settling onto a stool. "You've been here many years, haven't you? You must have seen such changes in the hall." The housekeeper nodded, her hands busy with the linens. "Since I was a girl, ma'am. The Harrows have been good to me, I'm sure," Miss Marple said, her knitting needles clicking softly as she drew them from her bag. "It must have been a grand place in its day. Before Lady Beatrice's time, I mean." Mrs. Crane's hands stilled, her eyes darting to the door. "It was, ma'am, but that was long ago." Miss Marple nodded, her tone gentle but probing. "Clara's story about the widow in white is so vivid. You were here then, weren't you? It must have been a terrible shock, her disappearance." The housekeeper's face tightened, and she turned to a shelf, rearranging jars with unnecessary care. "It was, ma'am, a terrible thing. Poor girl, so young." "Did you know her well?" Miss Marple asked, her needles clicking steadily. Mrs. Crane hesitated, her fingers trembling. "I was only a maid, ma'am. She was kind, though, always had a smile, even when Lord Edmund was difficult." Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her voice was firm. "Difficult, you say? The diary I found suggests Beatrice was unhappy, even frightened. Did she ever confide in you?" Mrs. Crane's hands froze, and she turned, her eyes wide with panic. "Diary? I don't know anything about that, ma'am. I kept to my work." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her smile sympathetic, "but sometimes maids see things others miss. A word, a glance, small things that matter." The housekeeper's lips trembled, and she clutched the tablecloth to her chest. "She was planning to leave," she blurted, her voice barely audible. "She told me, one night, in the West Wing. She said she couldn't stay with him, that she loved another. I begged her to be careful, but then she was gone." Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes sharp. "Another? Did she name him?" Mrs. Crane shook her head, tears welling. "No, ma'am. She only said he was her heart's refuge. I never told anyone I was afraid. Lord Edmund was so angry, and then she vanished." Miss Marple reached out, her hand gentle on the housekeeper's arm. "You were young, Mrs. Crane. It was a heavy burden to carry." Mrs. Crane's tears spilled over, and she sank onto a stool, her voice breaking. "I should have spoken up, but I was scared. After she disappeared, they searched everywhere, even the well, but found nothing. I thought maybe she'd run away. But the whispers, I hear them too, ma'am. It's her, begging for help." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. "You've carried this a long time, haven't you? Thank you for telling me. It may help Clara more than you know." Mrs. Crane wiped her eyes, her voice steadier. "Please, ma'am, don't tell Mrs. Harrow. She'd think I failed the family. Your secret is safe," Miss Marple said, rising. "But secrets have a way of coming to light, Mrs. Crane. They always do." She left the pantry, her thoughts swirling. Beatrice's plan to flee with a lover, her fear of Lord Edmund. The housekeeper's silence, it all pointed to a betrayal that ended in tragedy. The locket and laudanum from the greenhouse, the earring from the west wing, the diary's cryptic warnings, they were pieces of a puzzle, and Mrs. Crane's tale was a crucial thread. That afternoon, Miss Marple joined Evelyn in the drawing room, where the fire crackled feebly against the fog's chill. Clara was resting, Evelyn said, and Dr. Vale had prescribed a new tonic. Miss Marple's thoughts lingered on the laudanum vial, wondering if Vale's remedies were as innocent as he claimed. Evelyn, she said, her tone conversational, Mrs. Crane seems devoted to the family. She must have been a great help during difficult times, like Beatrice's disappearance. Evelyn nodded, her embroidery idle in her lap. Lydia's been a rock, Jane. She was here when I married into the family, always loyal. Loyalty is a rare gift, Miss Marple said, her needles clicking, though it can weigh heavily, keeping certain truths hidden. Evelyn's eyes flickered, but she said nothing, her fingers resuming their work. Miss Marple changed the subject, her mind on the well, where Blackwood had dropped something and Vale had lingered. She resolved to watch both men closely that evening, suspecting their secrets were intertwined with Beatrice's fate at dinner. The household was tense, Blackwood's forced joviality clashing with Clara's silence. Vale was quiet, his eyes on his plate, while Mrs. Crane served with a trembling hand. Miss Marple observed them all, her thoughts on the housekeeper's confession. After dinner, she stationed herself in the library, her knitting in hand, the window offering a view of the well. As midnight approached, the whispers began again, faint but insistent. Help me. She watched the garden, but no one appeared, the fog too thick to see clearly. Returning to her room, Miss Marple examined the locket, the earring, and the diary, her notebook filling with connections. Mrs. Crane's tale confirmed Beatrice's fear, but the lover's identity and the betrayer's role remained elusive. Vale's laudanum, Blackwood's photograph, the well's glint, they pointed to a truth buried deep, and Miss Marple was determined to unearth it, one careful stitch at a time. Chapter 8. The truth that the Welver fog that had clung to Harrow Hall for days lifted by morning, leaving a sky of brittle blue and a chill that sharpened the air. Miss Jane Marple sat at the breakfast table, her hands folded around a cup of tea, her eyes quietly scanning the faces of the household. The dining room was heavy with the scent of toast and kedgeree, but an electric tension crackled beneath the surface, as if the house itself sensed the unraveling of its secrets. Evelyn Harrow, her face etched with exhaustion, presided with a faltering grace, her fingers twisting a napkin into knots. Clara, pale but resolute, picked at her plate, her eyes flickering to the windows as if seeking escape. Major Reginald Blackwood, his military bluster replaced by a brooding silence, sipped his coffee with a scowl, his knuckles white around the cup. Dr. Simon Vale, his spectacles glinting in the morning light, spoke little, his hands steady but his gaze guarded. Mrs. Lydia Crane, the housekeeper, moved with a mechanical efficiency, her apron strings taut, her eyes avoiding Miss Marple's with a desperation that spoke of guilt or fear. Miss Marple, her knitting bag at her feet, felt the weight of her discoveries. The diary of Lady Beatrice Harrow, its final entry a plea for help. The pearl earring from the west wing. The locket and laudanum vial from the greenhouse. The half-burned photograph linking Blackwood to Beatrice, and Mrs. Crane's confession of Beatrice's plan to flee with a lover. Each clue was a thread in a tapestry of betrayal and loss. and the well where Blackwood had dropped something and Vale had lingered seemed its dark heart. The whispers, clearer now, echoed in her mind. "Find me." Miss Marple knew the truth was close, and she resolved to bring it to light that evening, when the household's guard might be lowered. "Evelyn," Miss Marple said, her tone light as she stirred her tea. "The weather's cleared at last. Perhaps a walk in the garden would do us all good." Evelyn's smile was strained. "Perhaps, Jane, though the grounds are so dreary this time of year." Clara looked up, her voice soft but firm. "I'd like that, Miss Marple. The well always feels strange, but I want to see it in daylight." Blackwood's cup clattered against its saucer, and he coughed, his face reddening. The well, nothing there but moss and old stones. Waste of time. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. "Oh, Major, old places like that often hold surprises, don't you find?" he grunted, his gaze dropping to his plate, and Miss Marple noted the faint sheen of sweat on his brow. Vale, silent until now, adjusted his spectacles. "A walk might be refreshing," he said, his voice smooth but cautious, "though I've a patient to see later." Mrs. Crane, clearing the dishes, dropped a spoon, her gasp sharp in the quiet. Miss Marple's smile was gentle, but her mind catalogued the housekeeper's panic, a sign that the truth was pressing closer. After breakfast, Miss Marple slipped into the library, where she reviewed her notebook, its pages filled with neat observations. Blackwood's photograph, Vallee's laudanum, Crane's confession, Clara's visions, the well's glint. She added a note about the well, suspecting it held physical evidence of Beatrice's fate. Her plan was simple but bold: gather the household in the drawing room that evening and lay out her findings, watching their reactions to force the truth into the open. The day passed in a haze of routine, the household moving through their tasks with a forced normalcy. Miss Marple spent the afternoon with Clara, coaxing her to play the pianoforte, her gentle questions probing the girl's memories. Of the well? Clara admitted to seeing Blackwood there again, late at night, his face twisted with anger as he tossed something into its depths. "It looked like a chain," she said, her voice trembling. "Silver, maybe." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts on the glint she'd seen. A chain could be a necklace, perhaps linked to the locket or earring. She thanked Clara, urging her to rest, and made her way to the garden, where the well stood like a silent sentinel. She examined its rim, noting fresh scratches, as if something had been dragged across it recently. The glint below was still visible, tantalizingly out of reach. She would need the gardener's help to retrieve it, but discretion was paramount. At tea, Miss Marple steered the conversation to the hall's history, her tone light but deliberate. "Evelyn," she said, "the well must have been a fine feature in its day. Has it ever been cleaned or explored since Beatrice's time?" Evelyn's hands stilled on her teacup. "Not that I know of, Jane. It's been dry for decades. The police looked at it when she vanished, but found nothing." Vale cleared his throat, his fingers adjusting his spectacles. "Old wells are dangerous, Miss Marple. Best left alone." "Perhaps," she said, her smile disarming. "Though they can hold forgotten things, can't they?" Blackwood, who had been silent, shifted uncomfortably, his eyes on the window. Mrs. Crane, serving the tea, spilled a drop, her hands trembling. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, her mind weaving the final threads. That evening, after a tense dinner where Blackwood's forced laughter grated and Clara's silence deepened, Miss Marple requested a gathering in the drawing room. The fire cast flickering shadows. and the portrait of Lord Harrow glared down, its eyes cold and accusing. Evelyn, Clara, Blackwood, Vale, and Mrs. Crane sat in a semicircle, their faces taut with anticipation or dread. Miss Marple stood, her shawl draped over her shoulders, her voice calm but commanding. "I've been listening to Harrow Hall," she began, her eyes moving from face to face. "It's a house of secrets, and they're no longer content to stay hidden. Lady Beatrice Harrow did not vanish by chance. Her diary, found in the attic, speaks of fear and betrayal." She produced the diary, its leather cover worn but intact, and opened it to the final entry. "He knows. I fear for my life," she wrote. "Someone in this house knows what happened to her." Evelyn gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Clara's eyes widened, and Vale's spectacles slipped slightly. Blackwood's face reddened, his fists clenching. Mrs. Crane, standing by the door, swayed as if she might faint. Miss Marple continued, her tone measured. "There's more. A pearl earring from the west wing, where Clara saw the widow. A locket and laudanum vial from the greenhouse, hidden by Dr. Vale." She held up the locket, its miniature portrait glinting in the firelight. A photograph, half-burned, showing Major Blackwood with a woman like Beatrice, and the well where both the Major and Dr. Vale have been seen at night, where something glints in the depths. Blackwood leaped to his feet, his voice booming. "This is outrageous. You've no right to accuse." "I accuse no one," Miss Marple said, her voice cutting through his bluster. "I only ask questions. Clara, you saw the Major by the well, throwing something a chain, perhaps?" Clara nodded, her voice trembling. "Yes, 2 nights ago." He looked angry. Blackwood's face purpled, but before he could speak, Mrs. Crane let out a sob, sinking into a chair. "It's true," she whispered. "I knew she was leaving, but I never thought I should have spoken." Vale's face was ashen, his hands gripping his chair. "Miss Marple, this is conjecture. The laudanum was for Beatrice's nerves, nothing more." Miss Marple's eyes locked on Blackwood. "Major, you knew Beatrice. The photograph proves it. And the chain you dropped, it matched this locket." The room fell silent. The fires crackled the only sound. Blackwood's shoulders sagged, and he sank back into his chair, his voice hoarse. "I loved her," he said, his eyes distant. "Beatrice was everything. But she chose another, some artist. I begged her to stay, that night by the well. She refused, said she was leaving with him. We argued, she pushed me. I grabbed her arm, and she fell. It was an accident, I swear. I panicked, hid her in the well." Evelyn's cry echoed, and Clara clung to her mother, tears streaming. Vale's head bowed, his hands trembling. Mrs. Crane wept openly, her guilt spilling over. Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm. "And the locket, Doctor?" "The laudanum," Vale sighed, his voice low. "She came to me, frightened. I gave her laudanum to calm her, but I didn't know. I found the locket later, in her room. I kept it, thinking it would protect her memory." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes sad but resolute. "The truth is heavy, but it's out now. The well must be searched to give Beatrice peace." The household sat in stunned silence, the weight of Blackwood's confession settling like dust. Miss Marple's needles lay idle, her work done for now. The whispers, she knew, would cease once Beatrice's fate was laid to rest. Chapter 9. The Widow's Rest. The morning after Major Blackwood's confession dawned with a fragile clarity, as if Harrow Hall itself exhaled a long-held breath. The sky was a pale, unblemished blue, and the sunlight filtering through the dining room's tall windows cast delicate patterns on the polished mahogany table. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly, her hands folded around a cup of tea, her knitting bag at her feet. The household, however, was far from serene. Evelyn Harrow, her face drawn with a mixture of relief and sorrow, presided over breakfast with a mechanical grace, her eyes red-rimmed from a sleepless night. Clara, pale but composed, ate sparingly, her gaze fixed on her plate, as if afraid to meet the eyes of those around her. Dr. Simon Vale, his spectacles reflecting the morning light, spoke little, his hands steady but his expression one of quiet resignation. Mrs. Lydia Crane, the housekeeper, moved with a subdued efficiency, her apron strings looser today, as if her confession had unknotted some inner tension. Major Blackwood was absent, confined to his room under the watchful eye of the village constable. Summoned late the previous night, the air was heavy with the scent of toast and kippers, but the weight of the truth Blackwood's admission of Beatrice's accidental death at the well, Vale's concealment of the locket and laudanum, Crane's long-held silence, sung heavier still. Miss Marple, her mind as sharp as her knitting needles, felt the house settling, its whispers stilled for now. Yet the task remained to confirm Blackwood's story, to give Beatrice the rest she had been denied for 50 years. The well, with its glinting secret, was the final piece of the puzzle, and Miss Marple had already arranged for its search. "Evelyn," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle as she broke the silence, "the constable will be here soon to examine the well. It's a difficult day, but necessary, I think, for Clara's peace." Evelyn nodded, her fingers trembling on her teacup. "I know, Jane. I still can't believe it, Reginald, of all people. And poor Beatrice, all this time." Her voice broke, and she looked away, her eyes glistening. Clara reached for her mother's hand, her voice soft but steady. "It's over now, Mother. The whispers, they stopped last night. I didn't hear her." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles, though her expression remained sympathetic. "That's a good sign, Clara. The truth has a way of quieting restless spirits." Vale cleared his throat, his voice low. "I owe you an apology, Miss Marple. I should have spoken sooner about the locket. I thought I was protecting Beatrice's memory, but I only added to the secrecy." "You meant well, Doctor," Miss Marple said, her tone kind but firm. "But secrets, like stitches, unravel when pulled. It's best they're out now." Mrs. Crane, setting down a fresh pot of tea, paused, her eyes meeting Miss Marple's for the first time without flinching. "I'm sorry too, ma'am. I was young, frightened. I thought silence was safer." Miss Marple nodded, her smile warm. "You were loyal, Mrs. Crane, but loyalty to the truth serves best in the end." The conversation paused as the constable, Mr. Herreby, arrived, a sturdy man with a weathered face and a nonsense air. He greeted the household with a curt nod, his eyes lingering on the portrait of Lord Harrow above the mantel, as if sensing the weight of the family's past. Miss Marple accompanied him to the garden, where the well stood, its mossy rim gleaming in the sunlight. A gardener, armed with a rope and hook, awaited them, his face pale with the villagers' tales of curses. "Miss Marple," Herreby said, his voice gruff, "you're certain about this? The Major's story is grim, but we need evidence." "I'm certain," she replied, her tone calm but resolute. "The well has kept its secret long enough." The gardener lowered the hook, his hands steady despite his unease. After several tense minutes, he pulled up a tangled bundle, wrapped in decayed fabric. The constable unwrapped it carefully, revealing a skeleton, its bones brittle but intact, clad in the remnants of a white gown. A sapphire ring gleamed on one finger, and a silver chain, tangled in the fabric, matched the locket from the greenhouse. Miss Marple's heart ached, but her expression remained composed. Beatrice Harrow, the widow in white, had been found at last. Evelyn, who had joined them, stifled a sob, clinging to Clara, who stood silent, her eyes fixed on the remains. Vale, standing at a distance, bowed his head, his hands clasped tightly. Mrs. Crane, hovering at the garden's edge, wept openly, her guilt finally laid bare. Harrowby examined the ring and chain, his face grim. This matches the description of Lady Beatrice's jewellery from the old reports. I'll need to take Blackwood in for questioning, but this confirms his story. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes on the gown's faded lace. She deserves a proper burial, Mr. Harrowby, and the truth, however painful, will give the family peace. The constable agreed, and arrangements were made to transport the remains to the village, where a coroner would confirm the identity. Blackwood, summoned from his room, stood pale and silent as the constable read him his rights, his military bearing crumbling under the weight of his confession. Vale approached Miss Marple, his voice low. I gave her laudanum to calm her nerves, nothing more. I never knew. I thought she'd run away. I believe you, Dr. Miss Marple said, her tone gentle. But you might have trusted the truth sooner. He nodded, his eyes distant, and walked away, his shoulders slumped. Mrs. Crane, lingering nearby, whispered, "Thank you, ma'am, for her and for us." Miss Marple smiled, her hand resting on the housekeeper's arm. "You've done right. Now, Mrs. Crane, that's what matters." That afternoon, Miss Marple packed her valise, her work at Harrow Hall nearly done. Evelyn, her face softened by relief, clasped her hands. "Jane, you've given us peace. Beatrice can rest now, and Clara, she's sleeping better already." "I'm glad," Miss Marple said, her eyes warm. "Harrow Hall is a fine house. Evelyn, let it be a home again." Clara, standing by her mother, hugged Miss Marple tightly. "I'll miss you, Miss Marple. You made the whispers stop." Miss Marple patted her cheek, her smile kind. "Listen to the music instead, Clara. It's a better sound." As she walked back to Marigold Lane, her valise in hand, the estate's turrets faded into the afternoon light. The whispers of Harrow Hall were silent now, replaced by the rustle of leaves and the distant call of a rook. Miss Marple's steps were steady, her mind already turning to her cottage, where her knitting and her roses awaited. The truth had been heavy, but it had set Beatrice free, and Harrow Hall, for all its shadows, could begin to heal. Chapter 10. A quiet return. The late afternoon sun bathed St. Mary's, hollow in a golden glow, as Miss Jane Marple walked the familiar path along Marigold Lane, her valise swinging lightly in her hand. The air was crisp with the scent of fallen leaves and wood smoke, and the village, with its ivy-clad cottages and chiming church bell, seemed to welcome her back with a gentle sigh. Harrow Hall, with its shadowed turrets and whispered secrets, was behind her now, its mystery unravelled, its restless spirit laid to rest. The weight of Beatrice Harrow's tragedy, her accidental death at Major Blackwood's hands, confirmed by the bones in the well, had lifted, leaving the estate quieter, if not entirely at peace. Miss Marple's sensible shoes crunched on the gravel, her steps steady, her mind already settling into the rhythm of her own quiet life. At the end of Marigold Lane, her cottage came into view, its whitewashed walls and rose trellises, untouched by the drama she had left behind. The villagers called it the widow's porch, a name that amused her, though she was no widow. She set her valise by the gate and paused, her eyes scanning the garden. The marigolds, though fading in the autumn chill, stood proud, their golden heads nodding as if in approval. She smiled faintly, her thoughts drifting to the household she had left. Evelyn, her strength renewed. Clara, her fears quieted. Dr. Vale, chastened but relieved. Mrs. Crane, unburdened of her long-held guilt. Major Blackwood, now in the hands of the constable, faced a reckoning, but Miss Marple felt no triumph, only a quiet satisfaction that the truth had been brought to light. Inside, the cottage was, as she had left it, the air warm with the scent of lavender and beeswax. She set her valise on the hall table and moved to the parlour, where her wicker chair awaited by the porch window. Her knitting, left half-finished on the table, beckoned, and she took it up, her needles clicking softly as she settled into the familiar rhythm. The village was stirring, as it always did at dusk, children laughing in the lane, the postman's bicycle creaking past, the faint hum of gossip from the tea room. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp behind her silver spectacles, missed nothing, though her expression remained serene as she knitted. Her mind sifted through the events at Harrow Hall, the diary with its plea of fear, the earring glinting in the west wing, the locket and laudanum hidden by Vale, the photograph burned by Blackwood. The well, with its grim secret all, had pointed to a truth buried for 50 years. Beatrice Harrow's story, though tragic, was no longer a whisper in the dark. The village would talk, of course dailies of the widow in white would linger, embroidered with new details, but Miss Marple knew the whispers would fade, replaced by the ordinary rhythms of life. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Tom Bailey, the postman, his cheeks flushed from the evening chill, a letter in his hand. "Evening, Miss Marple," he said, tipping his cap. "Back from Harrow Hall, I hear. Quite a stir you caused." Miss Marple smiled, taking the letter. "Just a visit to an old friend, Tom. Nothing more." He grinned, unconvinced, and pedalled off. The letter was from Evelyn Harrow, written in her elegant, steady hand. "Dear Jane, words cannot express my gratitude. You've given Clara her peace and the hall its silence. The constable has taken Major Blackwood, and Beatrice's remains will be laid to rest in the churchyard next week. Dr. Vale has promised to stay on, and Mrs. Crane seems lighter, as if a weight has lifted. I hope you'll visit again when the shadows are fewer. For now, know that you've brought light to a dark place. Yours in deepest thanks." Evelyn. Miss Marple folded the letter, her heart warmed by its sincerity. She placed it in her desk, beside her notebook, where the details of Harrow Hall's mystery were neatly recorded. The village clock struck 6, and she rose to prepare tea, the ritual grounding her in the present. As the kettle hummed, she glanced at the porch, where the last light of day gilded the roses. The widow's porch was quiet now, its own secrets modest and benign. Supper was a simple affair: scones and jam, a slice of cheese, a pot of Earl Grey, and she ate alone, her thoughts wandering to St. Mary's Hollow. The village, like Harrow Hall, had its undercurrents, its small dramas and hidden truths. She thought of young Tom's flushed cheeks, the vicar's nervous ring-twisting, the tea-room's whispered gossip. There was always another puzzle, another thread to pull, but for now she was content to sit, her knitting in her lap. The world, outside her window orderly and calm. As night fell, a new letter arrived, slipped under the door by an unseen hand. Miss Marple retrieved it, her curiosity piqued. The envelope was plain, the handwriting unfamiliar, and the note inside brief. Miss Marple, there's trouble at the vicarage. Strange lights in the churchyard, voices at night. The vicar won't speak of it, but I'm afraid. Can you help? A friend, she smiled, her needles pausing. The village never stayed quiet for long. Tucking the letter into her notebook, she resumed her knitting, her mind already turning over the new mystery. Harrow Hall was behind her, but St. Mary's Hollow, with its own shadows, awaited. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled in the lamplight. Her heart as steady as her hands. There was always another story, and she was ready to listen. The end.